Hello everyone, and welcome to the Houston Center interview series. My name is Zimmermann, I'm the director of the Houston Center, and my guest today is Mary Harrington. Mary is a journalist with Unheard from the UK, and she's also author of the book Feminism Against Progress. And thank you for coming all the way over from England to talk to us about feminism, human identity, and if you find time, technology, which are all interconnected in your argument. So I wanted to start, Mary, by asking you sort of a general question to contextualize things. You call yourself a reactionary feminist, yes?
Yes.
So what is a reactionary feminist, and how does that position define how you approach, the many philosophical, political, and social issues that you're writing about?
The deep history of this was, I started out as a fairly bog standard progressive, like most people did who grew up in the 1990s. It's the end of history era. Everybody just assumes that's it, we're done. Now it's just more self-actualization, more shopping, more of the same, really. Or at least you can look back and laugh now bitterly, but that's definitely how it felt at the time. And for reasons which are too boring to go into, I woke up one day, some time after that, yes, I think it was after the global financial crash, and realized that I didn't believe in progress anymore. I didn't think it was a thing. I didn't believe progress, in some absolute sense. Can we really, how do we make the case that, we're better now than we were in, say, ancient Rome? It's not really possible to make that case unless you're omniscient, and we're not. So I didn't believe. So I decided I didn't believe in progress, but it left me with a problem because I still felt as though women's issues mattered. Feminism is something that I've always cared about. Women's issues, women's politics have always seemed to me as like a distinct set of challenges which can't be subsumed into sort of general human questions. But I found, having realised that I just didn't believe in progress anymore, it left me with a bit of a head scratcher. Is it possible to be a feminist if you don't believe in progress? Because these two ideas seem to me very closely bound up. And any time I tried to make the case to somebody that I didn't believe in progress, they'd say, but you believe in women's rights, don't you?
Yes,
you think,
and liberation and emancipation.
Do you want to go back to being subordinate to your husband? Do you think it doesn't matter that women got the vote? Ha, gotcha.
Yes.
And I thought, but have you got me? And it's a difficult problem to resolve. It took me a long time to think it through. The end result of that thinking through was the book Feminism Against Progress. And the way I resolved that paradox in the end was by rethinking, by thinking a bit more about what it is that we mean when we talk about feminism, and what it is that we think that, what is that? What is that movement? Why feminism? How did that happen? Why is it, can you antedate feminism to the classical era? Is it Christine de Pizan who invents feminism? Or is it in fact an artifact of modernity, and if so, why? And I came to yes, you can see proto-feminisms in, for example, Christine de Pizan, but it really kicks into gear with modernity. And I came to think that the reason it kicks into gear with modernity is because feminism is not some kind of prima facie evidence of moral progress which just spontaneously interrupts as we leave the dark Middle Ages behind and suddenly become these much more virtuous, enlightened creatures which we supposedly now are. And in fact, what the women's movement is, which emerges in Britain in the 18th and really with Mary Wollstonecraft onward, and then develops along these various different lines and pathways, a hugely complex subject, is in the women's aggregate response to the disruption caused by the Industrial Revolution. So if you take off the progress goggles, you take off what I call progress theology, because it really is a secularized version of Christian eschatology. There's a progress theory. We're immanentizing the eschaton, as William F. Buckley put it. At least that's the hope. Whether it works or not is a different question. But once you take off the progress theology goggles and look at what's happening in the women's movement in the 18th and 19th centuries in Britain, it's clear that what's going on there is a set of very concrete, very legitimate, really, responses to the Industrial Revolution and to the ways those disrupted women and disrupted family life and completely reordered the social organisation, in ways which had concrete impacts on how women lived, in ways which are distinct from those of men. And I've spent roughly the first third of the book talking about some of the specifics of how that happened and what that produced. But just for fast forwarding on, because I realise, the original question you asked me is about what in fact is a reactionary feminist.
Yeah, but you need
and
that.
I think the short answer to that is a reactionary feminist is one who still cares about women's interests, who doesn't believe in progress.
Right.
And to elaborate on what that looks like in practice is I think to say you need to take a materialist view of what a grounded anti-universalist and materially informed view of what constitute women's interests in any given particular context, and that may vary according to where you are in history or geography or under other conditions. And the overall arc and argument of the book was that having the Industrial Revolution was one tech transition which elicited a set of particular responses from the women's movement. And then in the 1960s, we went through another tech transition, which was the point where we turned those industrializing forces on ourselves and set about really first of all industrializing women through the technology of birth control, which opened up a whole new category of technological innovation and a whole new set of contingent conditions to which the women's movement had to respond. Mm-hmm. And originally those responses were very utopian, and it's my view that as that's worked its way through and some of the implications of that tech transition, which really what we're talking about there is the transhumanist tech revolution, which begins with the birth control pill. And as we've begun to work through some of those implications, it's become increasingly clear, and this is something that I think the radical feminists noticed first, that not all of those implications are in women's interests, even if the birth control pill initially seemed, from some perspectives at least, to be a net benefit to women, at least if you're the kind of well-off woman who prefers to be able to plan her life and would like access to the workplace and education and so on. Great. There were some other side effects which we prefer not to talk about.
Can I, right there, it's the Industrial Revolution and this kind of thing, but there's also a whole metaphysical shift going on, which you have gotten into, right? So,
yes.
Can you talk a little bit about because there's this denaturing, the denaturing of the woman through the pill, right? There's this. You've analysed this. Can you talk a little bit about the metaphysical shift that's going on there?
I mean, this is something I've probably elaborated on more since I wrote the book, because I was really struggling to find words for what we were even talking about over the course of that book, and that was really one of the things that drew me to the subject. Why is it so difficult to talk about what it is which is being glossed over in some of these really bitter, hot button culture war issues, like is sex work? Can humans change sex? What really is the ground of our identity? And I've come increasingly to the conclusion that what's repeatedly glossed over and treated as though it simply isn't there at all is the ground, which probably in layman's terms is human nature. Or, exactly, in more sort of classically metaphysical language would be formal and final cause. The form of a human and our directedness, to some ends more than others, or to some particular ends. All of which, historically and classically, through medieval scholastic theology, is grounded in a Christian understanding of the human person and a Christian interpretation of the entire fabric of reality, whose ultimate ground is God. And that's all there in the Middle Age. And what I've come to realise, and really this is a whole additional slew of thinking I've done off the back of Feminism Against Progress. What I've come to realise is actually the moment when that begins, when the first brick is removed from the foundations of that, is probably with Francis Bacon in the 17th century, the New Organon, where he explicitly says we need to discard formal and final cause in order to be able to rethink the way we do science, so as to discard all of this sort of wibbly-wobbly metaphysical stuff and focus on mastering human nature, as he puts it, for the relief of man's estate. At which point, all teleology goes out of the window, apart from the relief of man's estate, defined literally any way you want it to be. I mean, you can draw a fairly direct line from that to the birth control pill. In this case, on paper, it's supposed to be the relief of woman's estate. One of the arguments I made in Feminism Against Progress is that in practice, the contracepting of women turns out to be still for the relief of man's estate specifically.
Yeah, relief of responsibility.
Yes, the relief of man's responsibility and also just his literal relief.
And in that development, Mary, where do you? So people usually tell the story of that, and there's also the story of Descartes, the story of Galileo. So the split between mind and body with Descartes, and then the mathematization of nature through Galileo, where you have we turn everything into quantifiability, and then with the mind-body split, we now have the precondition for turning the body into this inert, what's your word? Meat Lego Gnosticism, right? That's a great line.
And actually in Descartes, again, you see that instrumentalizing language comes to the fore. I forget the exact quote, but I'll have to dig it out. But he's talking again about the sudden access of control, which is realizable when we look at the world in this way, without the wibbly-wobbly metaphysical stuff.
Yeah.
Without any of that woo. And really just to loop this back to the metaphysical problem, the metaphysical challenge in speaking to questions like, what is a woman, for example. It all really comes back to the erasure of formal and final cause, because it's exceptionally difficult to give any kind of coherent account of why somebody shouldn't, for example, use synthetic hormones to give themselves the appearance of the opposite sex. Yeah. It's incredibly difficult to make that case if it's not possible to say there is a normative arc of human development that is directed to these ends and not those ends. Yeah. I mean, how are you even supposed? I mean, to take one fairly contemporary culture war example, I've seen on the gender activist side, people making the case that all children's puberty should be medically interrupted until they've given their consent to developing along and to going through puberty, on the basis that nobody should be forced to go through puberty without having explicitly assented to that, which presumes from the word go that human nature is not a thing, or that human nature is a kind of outrage that's been visited upon us. The normative physiological development is an outrage that's been visited upon us, and we should not have to be. We should not be subjected to that. Which is, I mean, it's the Baconian paradigm in a nutshell, but applied to the development of children. And if we recoil instinctively from that and then sort of wave our arms around furiously trying to explain why this is such a wrong-headed idea, it's because we've abolished the vocabulary and the conceptual categories for talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, we've also abolished completely an embodied person, right? I mean, the sense that there's an embodied person, a rational spirit, or a spirit within a body that is developing. I mean, I remember my teens, how you grow into your body, you grow into a developmental.
Yeah.
I mean, so to disrupt that at the stage of that young is absolutely crazy.
Yeah. And I mean, these are things which people are beginning to learn the hard way. That in fact, these are you can't in fact abolish normal human nature, but. Unfortunately, having turned our technologies on ourselves and having turned the Baconian mindset on our own human physiologies, people are not going to be reasoned out of wanting to try.
So how do we? What's your, as a reactionary feminist, then what's your the way back? So we have a metaphysical issue, we have a philosophical issue, we have an issue that science can't solve. That's exactly the problem. If you have a materialist science that's cut off metaphysics, but metaphysics is what you need. You need an anthropology that tells you, look, this is our form, this is our purpose, or this is a good way of human living, which it can't tell us. But that's the paradigm in play. So how do we return, or how do we, reverse this?
Well, I don't think it's going to come through some kind of policy announcement, because it just isn't, is it?
No.
Honestly, I think we're going to get there by learning the hard way. And actually, I think we've been through enough iterations and enough generations now that I see at least some encouraging signs amongst younger women in particular that is starting to happen. I mean, by no means universally, but there is, for example, a subculture amongst younger women of rejecting the contraceptive pill as too psychoactive, too grave an intervention at too fundamental a level to be tolerable and acceptable. I mean, and this. I mean, it's a sufficiently pronounced subculture now that it's been written up in major newspapers, and I think that's also working through its that subculture is having mixed consequences in and of itself. But if there's a pushback coming from women saying, no, actually, I can't just interrupt fundamental aspects of my physiology in this way, and instead I need to be thinking about how to manage my fertility through ways which are more about attunement to my cycles. And this again is a significant subculture now emerging among young women, and I think that's and to me those are straightforwardly feminist developments, and they're reactionary feminist developments because they come from a place which is not about rejecting the givens of our nature, but about seeking a deeper understanding of and a more constructive relationship with those givens. And to an extent that implies accepting some that we're more directed in some ways than others.
Yeah.
And that in turn raises a whole load of provocative points, particularly for those who are still committed to the idea that we can all be literally anything that we want at any point. But if only we have the political will, which to me just seems very, very obviously not true.
So let me, in affirming that stance, right, we can be whatever we want. How do you gauge the role of our constant immersion in technology? It seems to me it's a thing that has a hold on us and keeps reaffirming this notion that we're a mind trapped in the body or whatever.
Right. Well, I think at the most obvious level, there's that old joke about how on the internet nobody knows you're a dog. And I think if for people who really are very online, it's very easy to end up with the impression that you can be anything you want, because online you sort of can.
Yeah.
I mean, to a very much greater extent than you can offline. I mean, I'm a fairly average-looking, middle-aged woman, but online I could, in theory, pretend to be anyone I wanted. Whether I can sustain the pretense indefinitely is another question. But I can pretend to be a 12-year-old girl, and there are all these stories online about people being catfished in various different ways, and people pretending to be something they really aren't, or indeed people being entrapped and entranced by.
So do we need online resistance? Like, do we need more, as part of this way back?
No, we need to touch grass. I mean, and again, the fact that these memes, these catchphrases are coming out of the internet and out of the online subcultures is to me evidence of the fact that at least some people are beginning to learn the hard way. That in fact, it's a very online catchphrase. When somebody just goes too far down some internet rabbit hole or other, the response is you need to go outside. You need to go outside, touch grass.
Yeah.
And again, I think there's the only possible avenue for hope, to my eye, is that people are going to learn the hard way, and that those will be the cultures that survive. Those won't be the cultures which turn out to just be nihilistic dead ends. That turn out to be so catastrophically out of tune with anything that they sort of disappear in one way or another. I mean, it's a fairly bleak assessment, I suppose, in that it wouldn't be such a bad thing, if we could also help to save at least some people from themselves. And there's probably a case for trying to save people with, slightly lower agency people. You could perhaps make a case for saving from themselves. But some people are just going to do whatever it is that they do regardless, and they're just going to have to learn the hard way.
Yeah.
And I'm cautiously hopeful that will happen eventually, but I think it's going to be horrible getting there.
Yeah. But you're relatively confident that human nature will reassert itself in a way.
Yes, I don't think it's possible to abolish human nature. If it were possible to abolish human nature, we would have done so already. We're 50 years.
We've tried. Yes.
We're 50 years into the transhumanist era, and the utopians. And this is actually my single greatest ground for hope. The utopians genuinely believed and promoted the contraceptive pill as a technology that would liberate us from the givens of sex altogether, and that we could all just embrace a kind of free-floating polymorphous perversity, and could just you read Shulamith Firestone, for example, who really does think that we're going to be able to do away with male sexual aggression and female whatever, and all of that stuff is just going to evaporate. In this very sort of Marxian way, like the disappearance of the state under communism, but for the givens of our embodied sexual selves, and that really isn't what happened.
No.
It really is not what happened. And instead, if anything, sex polarities are more pronounced than ever. And they've just somehow been weirdly sublimated and become cartoonified and have become again, another source for the sort of fracking of the human body and the human soul, in ways which can, in some respects, be really dark. Yeah. But just to round off that thought, what hasn't happened has been the abolition of sex dimorphism. Emphatically that. And people have been really trying. Off the back of the transhuman revolution, which comes with the contraceptive pill, where people assent for the first time to the idea that we can break normal human physiology in the interests of individual human freedom and self-actualization, and that this is something which, in principle, medical science is permitted to do. Yeah. This is a licit intervention in human life. Downstream of that, a whole infrastructure of interventions into the beginning of life. We now have IVF, we have embryo selection, we have commercial surrogacy, we have this whole litany of technologized and often highly commodified, highly profitable intervention. Really, a big fertility is big business. Commercial surrogacy is. I read a story recently about a house full of women who were being kept captive and were being used essentially as broodmares. For the commercial surrogacy industry. They were being used, human factories for babies for sale. That was happening. And this is downstream of the basic assent to the idea that our bodies can be interrupted and instrumentalized in a Baconian sense. Yeah. That we don't in fact have human nature, we don't in fact have human personhood, and we don't have human directedness. Yeah. And that we really are just fungible meat. Yeah. Items, just like the rest of the world, where resources to be used.
Let me change tacks for a second. I've been intrigued by something you said somewhat recently, where you gave a summary of your book, and then you said at the end of this talk that you've made this journey from writing about these things, and then you've arrived at. You said something like, "I've arrived at theology." I've also heard. You describe yourself as a mildly heretical Anglican somewhere. My question is, what role does theology play in how you look at things now? Would you say I'm a Christian thinker? Does that matter to you? Or how does theology help you think about human nature, think about retrieving these things that you've mentioned?
I don't think that this is quite the right forum for me to talk about my personal confessional. No. Standpoint, but on the question of theology and how it relates to all of, I suppose the simplest answer I can give to all of this is that if we're going to talk, if we're talking about the Baconian Revolution, you then have to understand the context against which the Baconian Revolution happened, which is scholasticism. And once you're into scholasticism, you can't really avoid theology, can you? You're back at, and I've come to think this is not something I've really elaborated enough to be riffing about it on video, but I've come to think that actually the still more fundamental silence behind all of the other things that you can't talk about is in fact St. Thomas Aquinas and his philosophy of reality, where really the broadly Christian Aristotelianism against which Francis Bacon was reacting was most fully developed and was phenomenally influential for really centuries throughout the High Middle Ages. And I don't think it's possible to understand how we got to where we got, how we got to where we are, without that piece being in place. And I think that's probably the most succinct answer I can give.
Okay.
We need to be reading Thomas Aquinas, because actually if we don't, we're going to end up reinventing a lot of wheels.
Yeah, and so you haven't thought about, when I read your book and I thought about the argument you make about disembodiment and how we need to return. I mean, the Christian teaching, which is central to Thomas, of the incarnation, for instance, right? That I mean, in Christianity, it's not Gnosticism. It's precisely the beginning, like with Irenaeus, against the Gnostic argument that the body is worthless and we just need to get rid of it and so on. So there are these resources, and it's central to Thomas. The other topic that's central to him is personhood.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, which
yes,
is,
absolutely. And I had absolutely no idea.
Okay.
When I wrote Feminism Against Progress, I was just reasoning really from my own experience.
Okay.
You know, I started with, I don't believe in progress. And then I had a baby and realized that certain facts about my embodied self were just irreducible.
Yeah.
And that actually that mattered, and that felt to me like an important and useful ground to start thinking about some blind spots in what I'd internalized as the sort of central tenets of progressive feminism. You know, why is there a mother-shaped blind spot? You go down that rabbit hole and you find yourself back at Thomas Aquinas. Right. Different route. Yeah. You know, why do mothers always appear in modernity as a problem to be solved? Again, you go down that rabbit hole, you end up back at human nature. Yeah. You know, why is it even possible to think about humans as coming in two kinds? You go down that rabbit hole far enough, you end up back at the book of Genesis. Yeah. And if you don't, then you don't really have anywhere to stand. And I think, you know, whether or not you're a Christian, if you have any intellectual honesty, as somebody who's trying to think things through, particularly, you know, in a way that honours what's already been thought and said, you can't just pretend that these things haven't already been thought and said.
A lot of people just don't know.
and you can't pretend that they haven't been there and that they're not still there in the discursive background. Yeah. That that they didn't have the influence that they had in terms of shaping where we are now. And to be, you know, to make any kind of an intellectually honest inquiry at all means speaking to that. And I've been really interested, actually, just to rant on this theme, just how common it is for people to go, you know, either from St. Augustine to Descartes, or even from Aristotle to Descartes, and then there's this whole bit in the middle where everyone's just like, so you just get the test card, and people just can't go. Then I think, why is that? why is it that people just cannot get their head round what happened between Aristotle and Descartes? You know, why do we have that sort of static? And this is not something I have a very detailed answer to, but I think, again, it comes back to Thomas Aquinas.
Well, you can't answer that question without Christian theology, right? Which is the development of so much behind it. Yeah. So on that, one question I had, the summary, you chart the journey. It's in some talk, I can't remember, maybe it was with Pajot, let's say Thomas talked about, I think he talked about the person, let's say he talked about the soul, then we watered that down to the self, and then we went to something like identity for the Lego Gnosticism.
This is a slightly different technological story, although it's a very closely related one. In that I think you can, in some respects, you can trace the arc of the West, so-called, as a story of Christendom. But there's a parallel arc, which again deeply connected. The parallel arc, which is to do with the development of information technology. It's a slightly less sort of uplifting and celestial story, but it's closely bound up, of course, with the question of theology. You know, we are Christians are one of the peoples of the book, and the book. You know, how is it that we have books? Because of the invention of the Greek alphabet. I mean, this is actually the theme of my next book. My starting thesis is that the singularity already happened. The singularity being the point where we merge with our technology, but that's additional to that. The point where we merged with our digital technologies was not the first singularity, because the last one was the printing press, and the one before that was the Greek alphabet. And what I think is so interesting, and really where I began that riff that I think I went through with Jonathan Pajot, is that it's with the invention of the Greek, really with the propagation of literacy in the form of the Greek alphabet, that people begin, that the axial age happens, and then this whole really the foundation stone of Western philosophy begins with Plato and Aristotle, and then people start thinking about the soul as such. People begin, and to me it seems intuitively obvious that it would become possible to speak of humans having an inner life as such in conjunction with the development of literacy, because it's with literacy, and this is a point. This is not an original point for me. This is Walter J. Ong, who's I'm sure you're familiar. Well, who makes the case that literacy fundamentally reshapes consciousness. In the experience of hearing words in your head from somebody who's not actually present, completely rewrites. And again, it's impossible even to speak in these terms without bumping up against textual metaphors. It completely rewrites human consciousness, such that we begin to conceive of ourselves as having an inner life, as having a soul, and then the second stage, the second of those singularities, which is the printing press, transforms that again, in these immensely complex ways.
Yeah.
And the third singularity, the recent one, which I think roughly coincides with the launch of the first iPhone, because that's the point at which we just went fully online.
Yeah.
And we're now a digital first culture rather than a print first culture. That relationship with the word, that relationship with either the written word or the spoken word has shifted again.
Yeah.
And it's really brought about. It's finally fully realised what Father Ong was talking about with secondary orality. Which he predicted would come with TV and radio, but in fact wasn't really fully realised until the digital era, because people can now just scroll TikTok.
Yeah.
And actually people really do just not read long form anymore.
Yeah.
And everybody, all the literati are panicking as a consequence of that, because they've just realised that this actually has some major knock-on effects for culture at scale.
And then identity is just basically our response patterns, right? That are on the phone. I mean, that's. Yeah.
Well, yes and no, and I
that's
mean
what Kurzweil thinks, right?
Yeah, possibly. That's it. Yeah, that's one way of framing it. I mean, identity is, you could say, from one point of view, it's what you get when the experience of when the textually enabled experience of interiority is attenuated by being constantly online, and then you end up with this very, very much more minimal. I think this is Angela Franks's phrase, the minimal self.
Let me ask you, if my question went, I wanted to know if you could own the notion of person as a word, because when I think about this soul, self, and identity, even the soul, like for the Christian vocabulary, for Thomas vocabulary, the person is the fullest, expression of all of those, right? Because animals have souls. But human beings have a rational soul for Thomas, and that's an embodied rational soul, which makes us person. So, could you see yourself championing the notion of personhood in that sense, or?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, because that's.
I think there's probably 18 pages of footnotes, which I'd love to hear from you after this conversation.
Yeah.
Before I can give.
Well, it's what you said triggered it, because it's this whole medieval, out of which come the proper understanding. We could probably talk about that for hours, of human rights, right? Which is tied to the dignity of the person, but the person is this embodied spirit, which is why. The inviolability of the body is a human right, because it is part of who you are as an embodied spirit, right?
Yeah, if I remember right, the soul is the form of the body, as the Thomist formulation.
But it's a rational soul, right, for the human being, which makes all the difference, because that's then the spirit made in the image of God, which is what you've also written about. So that's what made me ask you the question about theology, and to what extent, perhaps increasingly, I don't know, theology becomes a way for you to assess what's happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's more. It doesn't seem to matter which way I pick at the problems, and the really very often very concrete political challenges, which people, the things people argue about on the internet, in a nutshell. Yeah. Every single one of those that I come across and that I find interesting, once you rummage deeply enough, it cashes out as a metaphysical problem. Yeah. And it's impossible, and it turns out again and again and again that it's not possible to resolve those metaphysical problems without going back to the scholastics.
No, indeed, and therefore Christian theology.
Right.
Yes.
And I'm really. I've sort of arrived in the foothills of that, and I'm just looking up, going, uh-oh.
Yeah, no, and I'm with you there, because I'm often, I'm not accused, but challenged that, Jens, why don't you do more in interfaith discussions and so on and so forth. I've spent 30 years, I'm still trying to figure out, like Christian theology. There's a lot there, especially in those discussions.
I think it's, to an extent there's a translation problem, there's a language problem.
Yeah.
In that, people, one of the ways in which the medievals have been traduced is by people accusing them of woolly-headedness, of being sort of vague or superstitious or woolly-headed. It's not true, they were massive nerds. And Aquinas has a capacity for abstract thought, which is just complete. I've never seen anybody who can think like that today, apart from maybe particle physicists. There's an extraordinary capacity for abstract thought. But it's very difficult, because we're so much more woolly-headed now, it's very difficult to translate that, because it's, you can take one passage from the Summa and spend 5,000 words glossing that for our contemporary patterns of thought. It's exceptionally difficult to do. It feels really like a mountain to climb. I take a single concept from the scholastics, like the idea of a substantial form, for example. A basic concept from scholastic metaphysics, and I think, okay, now this feels to me like a really useful explanation for why it's okay to why it feels violating to turn a pig into deli meat. Like why there's something alarming going on there. It's the same proportion, the same number of atoms, right, in this lump of deli meat as there was in the pig. What's wrong with that? And you need a metaphysical concept like substantial form in order to explain why it feels like something violent just happened. But then you realize that to explain that takes thousands and thousands of words if you're going to do it in normal person. Whereas, Aquinas will just, he'll just throw a concept like that at you and then move on, through 3 or 4 others, and you're thinking, I feel too stupid for this.
Well, you've had lots of work to do. I want to end by taking this in another direction. Identity is a big thing in politics, right? And you've written on these things, and I want to tie to the question of, as you say, you dig deeper and you get into the metaphysics, and it seems like Christian, or at least scholasticism, and therefore Christian theology is coming up. So, as you know, as a Brit, and I come from Germany, there's this whole discussion in Europe in particular about national identity tied to Christian values that should be at the heart of the Constitution, which are at the heart of the Constitution, let's say in Germany, and people feel threatened that these things are being lost. And politicians don't seem to get why people are angry. So a whole bunch of this fear is classified as right-wing extremism when people start talking about these things, right? What are your thoughts about that? Like, should we... So let me just start. Christian values, like what is that? Is the West Christian civilization? Do we need to recover the Christian values? Richard Dawkins talks about recovering Christian values. He's an atheist. So what's going on there? This is
exceptionally difficult territory and exceptionally sensitive territory. So I'm going to choose my words carefully. One of the reasons this is so difficult to talk about is because in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was generally decided, I think not without reason, that national identity was simply too national identity, or a sense of togetherness as a people, plus modern military technology and particularly nuclear weapons was simply too explosive, very literally a combination, and just led to horrific bloodshed and holocausts and other atrocities, and that therefore the only possible path forward for maintaining comparative peace among the peoples of Europe was to try and abolish peoples. So that was the positive intended outcome, to ensure peace among a set of historically pretty fractious and bellicose groups within Europe, and this has been effected from the vantage point of America, where it has been relatively successful, merging all of those different ethnic European ethnicities into one sort of general vague category that Americans call white people or just Americans. in a sense, America is the proof of concept.
The melting pot kind of
exactly.
idea. Yeah.
America is the proof of concept that you can abolish peoples amongst Europeans overall and create this sort of macro category, which is just Americans. And perhaps we could generalize that to Europe. Has it worked? I think that's a more difficult question. There's a secondary question, which again sort of goes to some of these older metaphysical ones, is what is the ontology of peoples as such? Mm-hmm. Now, I don't really know the answer to that. This is something I think about a lot, because some of the avenues of thought that it opens out onto seem to me to go in potentially quite alarming directions. So some of the, let's say we agree that ontologically peoples exist as distinct from one another. How do we understand the boundaries of a people?
Yeah, yeah.
How do we understand who has a right to live where or not? These become very quickly very concrete and sometimes potentially very violent questions. Yeah. They don't necessarily need to be at the small scale, but at the large scale they do. Nation states, as formulated under modernity, map very unpleasantly onto the much more diffuse categories of nations in the Old Testament sense. As, however, and yet, because there is an and yet, people still have some kind of a reality. And again, if we're going to go back to theology, the Old Covenant states very clearly that God created the peoples of the world in their nations, and that old covenant was never revoked in Christian theology. So there's this and yet, again, because there's an and yet to that. In the New Testament, it's very clear, emphatically clear, that the Holy Spirit was not just for the Jews. The Holy Spirit was for everybody. So how do you resolve those things? How do you resolve the Old Covenant of the nations with the New Covenant of the Holy Spirit being for everybody? And this is a question which I'm just so far unqualified, really, even to address, that I don't know where to begin with that. But so you're the theologian.
Well, so what do you think of this? I've been dying to ask you this. Just your opinion, right? I mean, what do you think of this? So I totally agree with that. It's a really good analysis. And then, so in the New Testament, has the new humanity in Christ, right? Christ. Like Paul says, there's Jews and Gentiles. I think it's paradigmatic for the ethnic divisions, but there's now one new humanity in Christ. And frankly, in the ancient world, there's always been only one race. There's one genus, which is the human, right? There are no, like, races is something that really, I think, comes up in the scientific way in the 19th century or somewhere, right? That the raceology. Like it's just,
which again, I think you can make the case that that's a byproduct of Baconian civilization.
Yeah.
And that once you put the idea of nations through the filter which removes formal and final cause, then you end up with racialism.
Right. So I think what we need to recognize is something like ethnicity matters. The where you've grown up historically with certain customs and so on matters. But it's not ontologically the foundation. Like, the foundation is a common humanity. So I think you need some kind of a construct that recognizes, the reflex that you mentioned at the beginning, the internationalism. So from a Christian perspective, my citizenship is not in this or that country. It's in heaven, right? And there's a common humanity in Christ. And yet I'm an embodied person. So historically, like, I can't shake my Germanness in some sense, right? And whatever that is. But it's not the ontological ground of who I am, and yet it is part of who I am. So we need to kind of recognize these both sides. So I don't think post-nationalism has worked. I don't think it can work, because you're basically telling people, you have no history. Your history doesn't matter, your embodiment doesn't matter. That's not going to work. So,
and I mean, you can also make the case that trying to be post-nationalist is yet another case, and yet another instance of trying to immanentize the eschaton.
Right.
In the sense, what you're trying to realize is Christian universalism, but in this world, which is a fundamental category error, right?
Yeah, right, which is not going to work. So we need these kind of. So my favorite theologian Bonhoeffer has this. He calls it the ultimate penultimate sense, and you have to hold both of them together. So penultimately, like, I am German, penultimately I'm this male, penultimately I'm in this kind of ethos that's there, and that I think people rightly feel that it's, if it disappears, you've lost something. But ultimately, I'm not defined by my Germanness, or I'm not defined by my history, but you have to hold these in tension, as you say, until the eschaton arrives, right? But how do you do that politically? How do you do that constitutionally? How do you do that in a sense of having people give you enough time of the day to listen to these kind of, to that kind of complexity, right?
That's right. Is it René Girard who says that Jesus was the first political atheist?
Yeah.
In the sense that he was the first to assert that it's not for the state to arbitrate on these questions.
Because this is what also plays into this, right? That with the post-nationalism, as we're finding out, especially, I don't know where you're on this, but I'm just tell my view in Europe, because it may have been this idea of a melting pot and borderlessness. But as you then find out, when that comes with a hugely administrative, managerial, increasingly authoritarian kind of government out of Brussels, that's a huge problem, right? That doesn't work either. So, so there's this notion that the state can actually save us. The state can actually give us the security. The state is what saves us, gives us our hope, gives us our foundations for things. That can't work either. No. But that's, so that's the tension I think that we're experiencing.
I think that's right.
I don't know what the solution is.
I don't know what the solution is, but it has often struck me that where the fundamental point at which the European Union went wrong was in trying to be Christendom without ever explicitly mentioning Christendom.
Right.
That happened at the moment of the founding. I think the very first founding charter. There was a decision was taken to leave out the confessional.
Right. We're at the end of our interview time, unfortunately, and I want to honor that. I have one last question I want to ask you. We just end on this. You can say whatever you want. I would love to hear your view, just ever so briefly. I'm frustrated with my business, like the church. I'm frustrated with the church, if I can say that, as a whole, because a lot of its pieces, its congregations as part, have bought into precisely the kind of things that you criticize in the book, right? Dissociation of the spirit from the body, the kind of progress narrative, and so on. Do you have a word to the church? What would you say? It's like people here, as someone who has written, reactionary feminist who has written this book, this is what I would recommend you do, or recommend you, you do.
Get rid of Zoom. Zoom church is haram.
Okay.
That's. I will not elaborate on that. Okay. Zoom church is blasphemous. Zoom Eucharist is profoundly blasphemous, and should never have been allowed. That's an atrocity that I actually think every church which tried to do it ought to apologise for. Get Zoom out of the churches.
Because it's virtual reality and not incarnational.
Yeah. I think if you're going to be a Christian, you have to show up.
Okay.
That's the entirety. You have to show up. When more than one of you is gathered in one place, I forget the exact line, but you know the one I mean.
Two or three are together.
Two or three are together.
Will be present among them.
Yeah, but you have to be together.
Yeah.
That's it really.
I'll take that as a very good ending and a good recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for showing up, for being here. Much appreciate that. I hope we can have further conversations. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for listening.